Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to focus attention on an organization that touches all 8.2 billion people on planet Earth, and that is the United Nations, and talk a little bit about its 80th anniversary. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Mr. Steve Schlesinger is a fellow at the Century Foundation in New York City. Mr. Schlesinger authored Act of Creation, Founding of the United Nations. He is also an expert on the UN and international issues. Steve Schlesinger, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today, Steve. We got 80 years to cover, 24 minutes. But we recall from our history books and from your book, excellent book, that the UN really was created primarily by President Franklin Roosevelt out of the ashes of World War II, where over 60 million people died. We saw Europe lay in ruins. Parts of Asia had been destroyed. These countries were trying to figure out how to rebuild and how to move forward in a peaceful fashion. And of course, the three main goals of the UN were to, first off, to eliminate the scourge of war, which is no easy topic to undertake. Second, to promote economic and social development. And the third was to enhance human rights around the world. We've seen that those three goals are still applicable today. But today, the mandate for the United Nations is much, much broader than what it is. What are some of the areas that the UN is dealing with that they never even thought about after World War II?
Yeah, I mean, the UN has really taken on the responsibilities of people's lives from birth till death. It's quite remarkable because in 1945, when it was originally set up, it was really aimed at the one issue that most concerned the humanity at that time, and that was security. They'd just been through, as you mentioned, the Second World War, 60 million people had died. The First World War, 30 million had died. They couldn't abide the notion that there should be a Third World War. And this was even before they knew about the atomic bomb, which, of course, put a whole nother dimension on the issue of worldwide conflict. So, yes, the security body is the absolute essence of the UN today. But building on that was, of course, a desire to make the economies of countries more stable, because bad economies can lead to conflicts. And therefore, the UN set up the Economic and Social Council, and they eventually created the United Nations Development Program and other programs like that, which are all devoted to trying to bring back to a middle-class level poverty that exists even today around the world. Of course, they also have a plan under this Sustainable Development Goals of actually cutting poverty in half by 2030. And then finally, human rights. The UN in 1948, actually, in a very great proclamation, created the UN, the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt had been very directly involved in that. And so human rights has been another essential part of the UN. Now, in all three areas, the UN has not necessarily achieved everything it wanted, but it's there to as an aspirational and inspirational charter to remind people of what can be accomplished if they work at it. And therefore, the UN is very much part of the lives of everyone today on the globe.
Without a doubt. Majority of us have no idea how the UN touches our lives, but it does. And we're going to talk in general terms about that in just a few minutes. But I mentioned about the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, and that's quite an accomplishment in itself. You were instrumental in putting together a video, a 3-minute, 30-second video that was used at the United Nations to launch the 80th anniversary. And what we're going to do is we'll go to this video and then we'll come back and talk about that. But let's go to the video.
In 1945, when the UN was created, humanity had gone through two catastrophic wars. The First World War, in which 30 million people or so had died, and a Second World War in which another 60 million people had perished. So the demand by the states to have some sort of security in the future to prevent the outbreak of a Third World War was so insistent that when President Roosevelt of the United States proposed creating this body called the UN, there was an immense attention given to the idea and great enthusiasm among the states that had won the Second World War to come together and actually put together this unusual organization that would stamp out the possibility of conflicts in the future. And that's what brought them together in San Francisco in 1945, and they drafted the UN Charter.
And it is now my duty, my honor and my privilege in the chair to call for a vote on the approval of the Charter of the United Nations.
The UN Charter was the sum and substance of humanity crying out for some sort of world order. They created a charter which reflected the aspirations of humanity for peace, for negotiating settlements, for handling food shortages and dealing with health issues and transportation and all the features that go into living a life on the planet. And that was the notion behind the UN. And frankly, the spirit was very enthusiastic at that time. Of course, we now know today that the UN has survived for 80 years through many different crises, and ones that sometimes it helped settle and sometimes was not able to help settle. Nonetheless, the aspiration to have this organization around is so deep in the human spirit that I just think that had the UN dissolved yesterday, it would be reinvented today. It's just so necessary, and we still look up to it as the place to get peace in this world. The world of today is better off, frankly, than it was in 1945. I think it's so important to remember what the UN is all about, why the UN Charter, which was established 80 years ago, is so significant for our lives. It has helped give the ground rules about how people should live their lives, how states should work with each other, how disputes can be settled. So it's almost a kind of guideline for how lives should be lived and how the earth should be governed. The UN represents symbolically the idea of collective security, the idea that we are all together in the plight of humankind, and that we cannot act separately. We have to be unified. Remember, the Charter, the UN Charter, is something we should all treasure for future generations.
Steve, that was really interesting. I love the graphics, what we would call the background, the B-roll, and that type of thing. Really fascinating. Where was this video used at the United Nations? And I'm sure it'll be used all around the world, but where was it done at the very outset?
Yeah, it was done in the General Assembly Hall itself. At that point, on June 26th of this year, the UN decided that that would mark the day that they wanted to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the final day of the San Francisco Conference of 1945 that drafted the original charter. And they very nicely came to me and asked me to put this video together to kind of introduce the event, which was held that morning on June 26th, and then was followed by speeches from other UN leaders and of the different agencies that involve the organization. And it was quite a spectacular event. All 193 countries were represented there. And it sent out a signal that the UN is still alive, it's still around, it's still trucking, as they say, trucking along, and is a vital part of world affairs. And I think it's so important to remember 80 years is a long time. Very few international organizations have lasted more than 20 or 30 years. So it's a great feat that we should be honoring in that 80th declaration, 80th year.
And you're right. And every day, as we mentioned, the UN touches our lives. It affects us, and we hear very little about it. And a large part of that is because of media disinterest. They just don't care. They don't inform people about it. They find it boring. They find it bureaucratic, but it's life-saving in many areas. But we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Where you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer and you like our show, please feel free to share it. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at an institution, the United Nations, that touches all 8.2 billion people on the planet. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Mr. Steve Schlesinger is the author of Active Creation, Founding of the United Nations. Steve, you're talking about this video, and we don't want to just dwell on it for 20 minutes, but talk a little bit about what happened on the opening session of this 80th anniversary at the United Nations.
Well, I think it was beyond symbol. Obviously, 80 years is an extraordinary length of time. But beyond just that symbolic point, it reminded the people of the world that there are 193 countries that are devoted to this single organization that is, they're all trying to work together to improve the lives of people around the world and prevent the outbreak of violence. And, whether it's looking after maritime safety with rules and regulations, or airplane behavior and landing and taking off, those kind of things. It touches the lives of every one of us. And there's no question that with there's a big part of the UN which works for refugees. And we know there are a lot of refugees today in this world. And hunger is a very dramatically evil part of the world today. We see it in countries that are war-torn or just, bereft of any wealth. And we do have to be focused on feeding people, keeping them alive. And also that gets into the issue of health, which is a whole nother, the World Health Organization, which is a spinoff from the UN, is part of the organization's remit. So all these things are remarkably consistent, have remained part of the body's lifeline for these 80 years. And that was what the honorific assembly back on June 26 was all about.
Mm-hmm. And you hit it on the head when you were talking about these services. Anybody that's ever taken a cruise on the Mediterranean or in the Caribbean, it's the International Maritime Organization that works with the shipping companies and the cruise lines to make sure that they're able to operate safely on the high seas. If you've flown KLM or Delta, it's the United Nations Civil Aviation Organization that helps move those jets safely in international airspace. Drop a letter in the mail to Tokyo, again, another UN agency. You watch the weather report tonight. It's the United Nations agency that helps distribute that weather information. We are not aware of these services, yet if we didn't have them, we would certainly miss them. There is no doubt about it. But the United Nations, in my opinion, does not get the coverage it should. And I'm not talking about just some glowing puff piece on the UN, talk about what it's doing well and what areas it needs to improve. And there are obviously both in consideration there. But with the United Nations, years ago, there used to be a whole page like of a newspaper that would be devoted to UN activities. Today you can't even figure out it's a UN agency. The articles say an international agency assisted 120 million refugees. Yeah, it was a United Nations relief or a refugee agency that helped them. And they don't even bother to identify that it was the United Nations. So the media really need to go back and try to rethink what they're doing. They're not doing a very good job, to be
No,
quite honest.
this is true. And one of the remarkable features if coverage is that outside of the United States, the UN does get considerable coverage because all the other countries of the globe, the other 192, do prize the UN and realize that it's helped them in different ways to keep alive and keep a society thriving. But the United States, even though under Franklin Roosevelt, we invented the United Nations, has, in a sense, pulled back from the organization and doesn't take, great belief in it anymore. So the press doesn't cover the organization very often. And we don't, in the United States, have much sense of the importance of the UN to our own foreign policy. And right now, unfortunately, under our present administration, the Trump administration, we're about to cut back significantly on our funding of the UN. And the US pays 22%, the largest donor of all the countries outside of China, which contributes 20%. We're gonna be cutting back, significantly because Trump's budget has already made clear that in 2026 they're going to cut back all international programs by almost 84%, which is an extraordinary reduction in funding, and it's going to hurt the UN significantly to the point where that our present Secretary General is already saying they're going to have to cut 20% in all jobs over the coming year just in order to survive the lack of US funding. So the UN is facing a considerable rough time in the coming years with that kind of money being absent from funding its yearly and annual budget.
It certainly has. And the UN has improved its efficiency and effectiveness considerably over the years. Years ago, waste was not a term we want to use at the UN because they didn't pay much attention to it, but they should have at that time. But they have improved immensely. And you look at the UN headquarters, the city of New York's fire department has a larger budget than the headquarters has. And the UN is covering the world in health areas, in transportation areas, economic development, human rights, on across the board. And it's a bargain for what we're getting. But you mentioned too about us dropping out of the World Health Organization. We can see there's another pandemic coming. And the same thing happened with the Trump administration when it was in the first time. They pulled out of the WHO and China moved right in. They said, fine, put us number one in the world. And the United States has done that. We have put China in the driver's seat by cutting our foreign assistance, by killing the USAID program, by pulling back from the United Nations. It's like we're surrendering from the front, not from the back. But this is an absolute atrocity of what has happened. And I liaison with Congress for years, and one thing was true. You had, I'm going to say, I can't put percentages on it, but a large number of Democrats sort of knew what the UN was about, but 95% of the Republicans had no earthly idea. And I don't say it in a nonpartisan way. I mean, I do say it in a nonpartisan way. They did not know what the UN does. You got all these myths out there about black helicopters and taking over our sovereignty. All of this is nonsense. And they still believe this stuff, even when the John Birch Society was pushing it back in the 50s. But anyway, this is what we're dealing with today. And how do you get this message across to the American public? They know very little about the UN. Yeah. The media don't help us learn. How do we do this?
It's very important that the UN have these, high school UN model UN sessions particularly around the United States, that that we put pressure on citywide UN organizations that are very much in favor of what the UN is doing, and they exist in many of the big cities around the United States. All of them have to put pressure on their representatives, both in Congress and the Senate, in order to exert the kind of enthusiasm that the Congress needs to appropriate the money that will keep the UN alive. Furthermore, it would be nice if the President of the United States would actually articulate his reasons for supporting the UN. I mean, I get back to President Trump again. He's not totally withdrawing from the organization. He's going to use it to put sanctions on countries he doesn't like. But otherwise, he doesn't have a lot of use for the UN Charter. I mean, he's already said that he'd be willing to go take over Canada as a 51st state, or send troops into Panama, or go into Greenland. And all those, if he were to do that, that is an open violation of the UN Charter. So he has to respect the fact that the U.S. joined the UN in order to uphold the principles of that charter. And that will be the most important thing, I think, to see how he behaves over the next 3 years, because he will be in office during a very turbulent time for the organization. So, yes, the press has got to take more of a responsibility. These model UNs and UN organizations in cities around this country should step up. And most importantly, we have to have a presence in the Congress of the United States to remind people the UN is so important to us and to the world.
Very true. And you will notice too that the press in the U.S. has really pulled back their coverage of the activities of the Trump administration. They've been coward, not all of them. Some of them are really good, but it's a minority. But you see even some of the prominent media people really pulling back and not doing their job. They're not reporting properly, or they put some of this idiotic nonsense stuff, in paragraph 18 out of a 19-paragraph article or something like that. But they have really, I think, negated their responsibility as the media in this country. And they're really, not only do the polls show America is really the laughingstock of the world, and the media go right along with that, hand in parcel. They are right along on the ride. That's about all we can say about it. But I understand how so many people complain about the UN at times being bureaucratic. But we got to remember, I think Winston Churchill summed it up when he said, "It's better to jaw than to war." And that sums it up. You're better to have diplomats discussing issues, arguing, whatever, at the United Nations in New York instead of going to war. Look at the disasters we've got out there right now. With you pick a spot where there's especially in Ukraine, but that's another issue. But one thing I wanted to touch on, and you and I have talked about this in the past, I think it's becoming more obvious that we can prove that the United Nations has prevented World War III. The UN has not been successful in everything it's done with peacekeeping and a variety of things. How do you perceive that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important point. After all, after 2 world wars, the UN was created to prevent a 3rd world war, and it has done so for 80 years. And the humanity, unfortunately, has it in its very essence to get into fights. It's part of our DNA. And yet the one big danger is a 3rd world war, which would involve atomic weaponry, which would destroy civilization. And there has been, in 8 decades, there has not been any breakout of that sort of war. Furthermore, there have been at least 25 to 30 conflicts around the globe in smaller states, from, I don't know, Guatemala to Cambodia to Angola, which were civil wars or invasions by other countries, but the UN helped settle them, which meant that they didn't spin out of control and lead to a greater conflagration. people forget that. That's why the UN has survived, even the fact that it hasn't been able to settle Ukraine or Gaza or wars like that, because it is still a symbol of how negotiation can lead to peace. And as long as it exists, as long as the charter is reminding people of the aspiration towards peace, it helps bring about the one thing we need, which is no more war. So I think people underestimate the UN and don't give it enough credit. And that, I hope, will keep the UN alive for many, many more decades in the future.
I think, was it Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State and former permanent representative of the U.S. to the UN, who said, if the UN's not perfect, but it's absolutely essential that we have it. If it didn't exist today, we would have to recreate it tomorrow. There is no way this high-tech world can get by without the services of the United Nations. We may not always agree with everything the UN does, and I'm sure there are many places where we don't agree with them. But the point is, at least they're getting together, convening 193 countries peacefully under the roof of the UN to deal with these issues and to work them out. But we could not get by, could we, in this world?
No, I mean, listen, it's quite impossible to imagine, even if we try to recreate the UN today, you'd get 193 countries to agree on a single charter. So we're lucky we did it at a time during the war when, you know, we had a kind of conglomeration of sponsors, 3 or 4 big countries who drafted the charter and then got agreement to it in San Francisco. And as you say, you know, the UN has its flaws. The UN Charter doesn't cover everything we wanted it to cover, but it's the only game going right now, and it's been remarkably successful despite its flaws. And so I would say that for all the disappointment or indifference that people have sometimes felt towards the organization, when times of crisis come up, where do they look? They always look to the UN. They know that the solution lies somewhere in that body. And I think that gives hope to the rest of the world that somehow, some way, we are going to prevent a third world war.
And you're right. The countries, if they're dealing with intractable problems, civil wars or whatever, what do? They go to the UN and dump the problem on the doorstep of the United Nations, say, here, you take care of it, we can't. And that's what it's there for. And they've got to give it the resources and the respect and the ability to do the job, or we're not going to be able to succeed. Well, Steve, we're down to about our last minute. Do you have any suggestions on how to improve the UN? I know we all want to restructure the Security Council, but that's written into the charter. That's going to be a tougher nail to deal with at some point. But are there any suggestions on how the UN can improve?
Well, the Security Council preeminently, because only 5 countries have the veto, and they basically control all war and peace issues in the council. So we certainly want to expand the number of countries that have the veto, or at least bring them in as permanent members, like Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, which were never part of the original sponsors back in 1945 because they weren't powerful, but they are powerful today. But in addition, I think countries should be coming together on economic issues far greater, meaning that the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, all these, which are all part of the UN, should be bringing more countries together to pool together their resources and help countries in the third world or suffering from immense poverty out of their situation, bring them back to middle-class status. And then finally, the human rights issue, which is essential to the respectability and individuality and dignity of human beings in the future. We've got to do more on that, and the UN has got to spread its wings even broader in the future.
Exactly. And all we have to do is to think back to the history books, or if we were there, to think back 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were one button away from nuclear Armageddon. to destroying the world. And the UN played a vital role behind the scenes in helping to diffuse that problem. And so there have been many other issues and problems like that over the years. Many of them we'll probably never even know about, but they're out there, and we've got to hopefully learn more about the UN. But was it Dag Hammarskjöld who said the UN was not created to take us to heaven, but to save us from hell? As I recall, that's a good way to end it and to think about the UN. Well, Steve Schlesinger, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.